Well, welcome to this week's Bible study. I want you to think back to a great meal you have had with friends or maybe family at one time. What made it great? Was it the food? Was it the service? Or maybe it was the ambiance, whatever that means. Chances are it was the company around the table that made it a great meal. A little over a week ago, I had the privilege of celebrating the wedding anniversary to my wife and partner for life. Linda and I celebrated 39 years together in the bondage of marriage. One of us is very happy. We had plans for our anniversary. Along with other couples, we were booked to go to this homey, rural community hall setting in Bruce, Alberta. All of us looking forward to the best steak, the best shrimp, the best salad bar, the best the West has to offer. Looking forward to laughing and telling jokes and just having a great night out with friends, celebrating anniversaries, celebrating birthdays, and just having fun together. And then came the virus, and we couldn't go. And now we probably wouldn't even if we could. Why? Because now we think differently. We think of how to protect ourselves. We don't think of enjoying a meal together. We think, how am I going to keep safe? Sitting around a table as friends, even with family, is out of the question because all we think and all we talk about is being safe, staying safe, following the rules, obeying the guidelines set out for us. I know they mean well, but really, I'm sick and tired of all the rules. And I know you are too. In Jesus' time, they had the same issues of germs and viruses that we have today. Back then, leprosy was rampant. People back then didn't have the World Health Organization. They had a group called the Pharisees. Now, please don't think I'm trying to equate the Pharisees of Jesus' time to the World Health Organization of today. Although, if you think about it, it's the same ideology. Control. This is what you can do. This is what you can't do. And it is the Pharisees, all well-intentioned, I'm sure, who in detail lay out their list of rules. Not just what they expect. They lay out rules of what they demand everyone follow. And this is the setting. And it is into this setting that Jesus steps. Turn in your Bibles to Luke chapter 14. I'll give you a moment to turn there. Luke chapter 14. And we're going to start reading at verse 1. But this is the setting that Jesus steps into. Let's see what Jesus is up against. Luke chapter 14, verse 1. If you could read that, please, Linda.
One Sabbath, when Jesus went to eat in the house of a prominent Pharisee, he was being carefully watched.
Okay, where is Jesus in this scene? He is invited out for dinner. Who invites him? A Pharisee. And not just any old Pharisee, but what? A prominent Pharisee. The New King James says one of the rulers of the Pharisees. Now, most of you know who the Pharisees are or were, but some watching this may not. And so allow me to give you a brief summary. Pharisees in Jesus' time are a political/religious party. They, along with another group called the Sadducees, formed the government of that day. And the Pharisees, devoutly religious, are devoted to the law of Moses, laid out in the books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And Pharisees are sticklers for the Mosaic law. Now understand, even though Rome controls the country, it is the Pharisees who govern the nation in a body known as the Sanhedrin, parliament, if you will. They make the laws of the land and they enforce those laws. Jesus is invited to have dinner at the house of a prominent Pharisee. I mean, it's like being asked to have dinner with Chrystia Freeland, the Deputy Prime Minister of Canada. Now, without disparaging Ms. Freeland, this is the setting. Some big shot Pharisee invites Jesus, along with a number of others, in for a get together, a meal. What day of the week is it? It's the Sabbath. Sabbath. Saturday. Today we call it Sunday, but back then it was Saturday. But this is important. It's the Sabbath. Pharisees are known for one thing: rules. Many of their rules center around the fourth of God's 10 commandments. Do you know what it is, the fourth commandment? Exodus 20, verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And that is pretty much all it says. But Pharisees, along with their buddies, the scribes, lawyers, if you will, turn the Sabbath into something altogether different than what God ever has in mind. God tells the people to set one day a week aside. One day to get away from their work. One day to spend with Him. To get replenished and refreshed, both physically and spiritually. But the Pharisees come along and add one rule after another so that the Sabbath becomes a burden rather than a relief. For example, do you know that in their list of do's and don'ts, no one on the Sabbath is allowed to walk across the grass? Because if you do, you break the blades of grass. And to break blades of grass on the Sabbath is considered work. So you have to stay away from grassy areas when the Sabbath day comes. And you can't cook on the Sabbath either. If anyone is caught cooking on the Sabbath, the Pharisees came down on them with both feet. In fact, to keep food hot can't fall into the category of work either. So the way you keep food hot is spelled out in tedious detail. Allow me to read to you an excerpt from William Barclay's book, The Gospel of Luke. I'm going to quote this. The Gospel of Luke. All food had to be cooked on the Friday. And if it was necessary to keep it hot, it must be kept hot in such a way that it was not cooked anymore. So it is laid down that food to be kept warm for the Sabbath must not be put into oil, or manure, or salt, or sand, whether moist or dry. I mean, who makes these rules up? You can't put your food into manure. I'm reading. But they could keep it hot. It may, however, be put into clothes to keep it warm. Could be put amidst fruits to keep it warm, or amongst pigeon feathers. Good night! Can you imagine keeping food warm using pigeon feathers? Who came up with rules like this? Man did. Pharisees did. And these man-made idiotic rules become more important than the general principle of God's law. And Jesus comes along with a revolutionary message that hits these legalists right between the headlights. This is the setting for Luke 14, verse 1. It's the Sabbath. And the leading, ruling Pharisee says, "Hey, Jesus, come on over and have dinner with us." Now, with all this in mind, look at the last part of Luke 14, verse 1. He, meaning Jesus, is carefully being what? Watched. Why? They're gunning for him. There is hostility. These are people who absolutely despise Jesus. They don't invite him in to feed him. They are looking for something to nail him with, literally. These folks are looking for a reason to put him on a cross. They deliberately invite Jesus in to eat a meal on the Sabbath at a high-ranking government official's home with a lot of witnesses present to trap him. There are 4 scenes that take place at this meal in Luke chapter 14. Scene number 1 are in verses 2 through 6. Scene number 2, verses 7 through 11. Scene number 3, verses 12 through 14. And finally, scene number 4, verses 15 through 24. 4 scenes, and each of these 4 scenes provides an opportunity for Jesus to instruct them and indirectly us. Today we are going to look at 3 of these 4 scenes, saving scene 4 for next week. In scene number 1, Jesus challenges the legalists. How does he go about doing that? Well, read verse 2, please.
There in front of him was a man suffering from dropsy.
Pretty simple, pretty simple. Who else is sitting at this meal? A person with dropsy. Now, what in the world is dropsy? My first thought was it's what the Edmonton Eskimo receivers have when they play Calgary on Labor Day, dropsy. And since I'm no doctor, allow me to read this explanation from his book, Exposition of the Gospel According to Luke. This is written by William Hendrickson. Anyway, William Hendrickson writes this. Dropsy, more commonly called edema, causes the body to grotesquely swell and often indicates a serious kidney, liver, blood, or heart condition. Adding to the swelling and the suffering, the rabbis attached a social stigma to the disease. To them, the disease was the bitter fruit of a grievous sin in that person's life. Back to verse 2. This man with dropsy, where is he situated? Right in front of Jesus. Why is he there? Why is he there at this dinner party? Remember the last words of verse 1? Jesus is being carefully watched. There is a sinister motive. Behind their watching eyes is a plan to trap Jesus into breaking the law, their law. Do you think this sick man just happens to be there? Do you think he just happens to be right across from Jesus at this shindig? It's an ambush. Jesus is being set up. The Pharisees have set Jesus up by purposely putting a sick man, a person in obvious need, directly in front of Jesus because they know he can't keep his hands off this man or keep from helping him. Read verse 3.
Jesus asked the Pharisees and experts in the law, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not?
Do you think Jesus knows what's going on? Of course he does. So how does he handle it? He asks them a question. He puts the pressure on them. And he asks, is it lawful to be healed on the Sabbath or not? Now, if you want to know their position, you can flip back 1 chapter to Luke chapter 13, verse 14, which states, He had just healed a person, and it states in verse 14 of chapter 13, ignorant because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, the synagogue ruler, note that, said to the people, there are 6 days for work, so come and be healed on those days, not on the Sabbath. To which Jesus, back in chapter 13, calls them hypocrites and totally destroys their law. Their law. Not God's law, their law. Completely humiliating the religious rulers. So now, shortly after, Jesus is at this dinner party, and he is being asked what to do. Actually, I'm going to rephrase that. He asks them what to do. Is it lawful to be healed on the Sabbath or not? He asks. Let's see their response, verse 4 of chapter 14.
But they remained silent. So taking hold of the man, he healed him and sent him away.
How did the Pharisees answer Jesus' question? They don't. They remain silent. Why? They know good and well that God's law does not forbid acts of compassion on the Sabbath. And after throwing down the challenge, is it lawful or not? Jesus hears a shuffling of feet, a few nervous coughs, but no one dares duel with him over this issue. So they remain silent. And Jesus breaks the silence and demonstrates God's position on the question. And what does he do? He takes hold of this man with dropsy, heals him, and sends him away. Note that, sends him away. Why does Jesus send him away? I mean, this is an opportunity for this healed man to rub shoulders with the rich and famous, the muckety-mucks of society. Why does Jesus send him away? I'm thinking, if there's going to be an argument over this, Jesus doesn't want this man caught up in the middle of it. Besides, this man wants to be with his family. He wants to be jumping and yelling for joy over his healing. So Jesus sends him away to do just that. Go on, get out of here. Then he looks back at his would-be accusers, and here's lesson number 1. Read verse 5.
Then he asked them, if one of you has a son or an ox that falls into a well on the Sabbath day, will you not immediately pull him out?
Thank you. Which of you who has a son? The New King James Bible uses the words donkey or ox instead of son. I was going to say something here, I probably shouldn't, but I will anyway. Teenage boys usually are donkeys, so you could put both of them in that situation. But anyway, whether it be a donkey, a son, or an ox, suppose this person or donkey falls into a well. And he says, which of you who has this son or donkey fall into a well will not immediately pull him out, even though it's a Sabbath day? Are you going to say, oops, it's Saturday? We'll just let him swim till tomorrow? Then we'll fish him out? It sort of reminds me of Bill Cosby's old routine, Noah, where Noah is asked, how long can you tread water? Notice how the Pharisees respond. Verse 6. Go ahead and read it.
And they had nothing to say.
And they had nothing to say. Again, they don't answer. Or rather, they can't answer. I guess they had heard that old proverb. Better to be quiet and thought a fool than to speak up and remove all doubt. I can imagine the hotshot host of this party trying to relieve the tension. So he invites everyone into the dining room. Read verse 7.
When he noticed how the guests picked the places of honor at the table, he told them this parable.
Everyone files into the dining room and finds a spot around the table. Now you can picture these societies. jockeying for the best seats, like a grown-up version of musical chairs. Where will the best seats be? Well, close to the host. Jesus also sees the sullen looks of those pushed to the far end of the table, away from the host. And Jesus sees all this and uses it to teach. And he never missed an opportunity to instruct. And this sets up scene number 2. Read verses 8 and 9, please, Linda.
When someone invites you to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor, for a person more distinguished than you may have been invited. If so, the host who invited both of you will come and say to you, "Give this man your seat." Then, humiliated, you will have to take the least important place.
Get the picture? You're sitting at a place where you shouldn't be. You're invited to a wedding. You're sitting at a place where you shouldn't be. And along comes the host and says, excuse me, this table is reserved. You're going to have to move. Oh, by now all the tables are full. And so he says, there's a table way back there, right next to the kitchen. You can have that one. And as you get up from the real nice table, right near the front, how do you feel walking all the way to the back, right next to the kitchen? How do you feel? It's embarrassing. It's humiliating. But what's the lesson? I think Jesus is saying, don't go looking for the limelight. If you belong in the spotlight will find you. In fact, what does Jesus say in verse 10? Go ahead and read that one.
But when you are invited, take the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he will say to you, "Friend, move up to a better place." Then you will be honored in the presence of all your fellow guests.
Again, do you get the picture? Sure you do. It's very easy to understand these word pictures. But then Jesus gives the principle in verse 11. Read that one.
For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted.
And exhausted too. You won't read these words in People magazine. You won't hear them at a business seminar. You won't see them on Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous, because we live in a self-exalting society, and don't you ever forget it. You promote yourself. You exaggerate your abilities on your resume. And you make sure everybody knows who you are and what you can do. And we feed our ego and we feed our pride. And Jesus says, stop doing that, as he pushes his long, bony fingers right into my chest, right into yours. Now, I think men have a harder time with pride than women do. For some reason, men have the need to have their egos stroked. And why God in his wisdom gives us wives. I remember a story of a young up-and-coming pastor who was getting a real following at his local church. After one Sunday morning, a longtime member, let's call her Mrs. Brown, says to him, "Pastor, you are becoming one of the greatest preachers of this generation." Well, the pastor thanks her, gets into his car with his wife to drive home. As they drive, the pastor says to his wife, "Honey, you know what Mrs. Brown said to me? She thinks I'm becoming one of the greatest preachers of this generation." His wife doesn't say much. So the pastor continues, I wonder how many great preachers there are in this generation. To which his wife responds, "One less than you think." If Jesus is so opposed to pride, does that mean we should walk around with our head hung down, dress in shabby clothes, and never take a position of leadership? Those who take things to extremes bother me. Never take a position of leadership or walking around like an unmade bed doesn't make you more humble or less proud. It's not the what Jesus is speaking against. It's the why. Why do I accept that role on the church stage? Why do I accept that position? So I can praise and glorify me, or so I can praise and glorify God? It's all about our motives. Why? Scene number 1, Jesus challenges the legalists. Scene number 2, Jesus reprimands the proud. Let's move on to scene number 3. Jesus turns from these guests who want to be seated near the host and turns his attention to the host himself. Remember who this host is again. A prominent, powerful, religious, and political ruler. What kind of people do you think this man would normally invite over for dinner? Let's read verse 12 through 14. Sorry.
Then Jesus said to his host, "When you give a luncheon or dinner, do not invite your friends, your brothers or relatives, or your rich neighbors. If you do, they may invite you back, and so you will be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous."
Normally, when we invite guests over, we ask people in who are in our circle of friends. Well, of course, we're comfortable around them. We have things in common with them. Oh, we may invite folks in who we don't know that well, but usually they're people we think might fit into our little group. It's called a clique. Is there anything wrong with cliques? Can a church become a clique? We often give our hand in kindness and friendship to certain people because we're comfortable around them, and they will return the favor and invite us back. In these verses, the voice of Jesus is telling the host and us to spend time with those society has cast aside. And he lists them: the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, the hurting, the neglected, those with nothing to offer back. Then Jesus gives us this advice, verse 14. If we do reach out to those where we expect nothing in return, God will reach into his vault of glistening treasures and reward us when we step into his kingdom. Throughout his time on earth, who did Jesus want to be around? Who did he want to spend time with? Those who fit into this group at this dinner party? Or those who nobody else wanted anything to do with? Jesus attends a dinner party here and turns it into an opportunity to instruct. Let's recap what he taught. In scene 1, Jesus rebukes legalism. Legalism makes us short-sighted. Rules become more important than compassion. Legalism blinds us to anyone who doesn't follow our list of acceptable behavior. That was scene 1. In scene 2, Jesus teaches that pride backfires and makes us selfish. We start playing the childish game of who's better than whom, and we all end up losing. In scene number 3, Jesus teaches us compassion and sensitivity to the needs of others. It helps us overlook the size of a person's wallet if we do that, because we're looking far deeper. We begin seeing others through Jesus' eyes and not our own. So in closing, ask yourself, Which of these three scenes is directed to me? Am I more concerned with rules than I am with compassion? Is pride a problem in my life? Is there someone I've been neglecting just because they don't fit into my clique? Did any of those at this dinner party listen to Jesus? We're not told. But we can assume they went on unrepentant with their meal. And we can do the same. We can listen politely to what Jesus says in this chapter and leave here completely unchanged. Let's not do that. Jesus' teaching requires a response. Let's pray. Our loving God and Heavenly Father, again, looking in your word is so eye-opening if we look at it and really study it. Through this short few verses, you've given us three teaching methods that we can examine our own lives. Are we becoming legalistic in the way we treat our rules? Are our rules more important than our compassion? Or is it number two, that we have this pride in us? And we try to hide it, but it's always there. We always want to show off just a little bit. Or is it number three, where we only have our select group of friends and nobody else can enter that clique of friends? Scenes that apply to us today as much as they did the Pharisees way back when you walked this earth. As we close this lesson, help us to learn from the teachings that you gave them and now us. Help us to look at the areas that we need help in and rely on you for that help, because you will always be there to give us instruction and give us guidance if we ask you. And now as we leave this time together, watch over all who are watching this. Guide us back together if this is your will next week.